Welcome to part 2 of Chapter 11's Chapter Notes on the Congress as we take you through the legislative process, how a bill becomes a law, wrapping up this chapter on the Congress. And we're going to kick off part 2 by looking at how a bill becomes a law. I'm just a bill. You may remember that Schoolhouse Rock video that you can watch on YouTube if you haven't seen it already. But the idea here is looking at the entire legislative process. We're going to take a minute and go through this diagram. This is one that I think really does a good job of detailing how the House works and how the Senate works in terms of this process. So let's look on the left-hand side here. If a bill is introduced in the House, put in the hopper, it's given a code of HR. You can see it here in the little character. HR 42 or HR 1 is where we start for each of the numbered Congresses, as we talked about last time. We're currently in the 115th. So in the 115th Congress, we have HR 1, and in this case, it would be introduced. It would be referred to a subcommittee within the committee structure, the standing committee structure. And the idea there is that the subcommittee would decide whether there is whether it is sufficient editing and any types of changes or tracking that needs to be done to the bill in order to refer it to the full committee. If that doesn't happen, the bill dies. If it does happen, then it would be reported out to the full standing committee. They would vet it, they would edit it, they would make any changes, any amendments, if you will, and then vote on it. And then if it does survive that process, it would be reported out, is what they call it, reported out by the full committee, and it would go to the Rules Committee. Now, up to this point, everything in the Senate side is almost exactly the same. A bill introduced in the Senate would be referred to a subcommittee, then it would go to the full committee, and if it passes out of the committee with amendments, changes, edits, then it's going to be reported out by the full committee. The difference here is that in the House, it goes to a Rules Committee. Remember, we said the House is much more formal because you have 435 members. Not everybody can get up to speak on every bill. Not everybody can add amendments to every bill. You'd never get anything done if you had all 435 members trying to do those things. So you have a Rules Committee that is basically picked by leadership. Again, think of the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader picking who's on the Rules Committee, and they're going to guide that bill in terms of what is and is not allowed in terms of making changes, in terms of who's going to speak on it, for how long they're going to speak, and when they're bringing the bill up for floor action, ultimately for a vote. So the Rules Committee is going to decide that in the House. In the Senate side, the Majority Leader essentially makes that decision and can confer. It doesn't have to, but can confer with the Minority Leader in terms of how they carry that out for the agenda. So then, if floor action leads to a positive vote in which it passes, then it would go to the other chamber. So if it passed in the House, it would go over to the Senate, and the process would start all over again. If it passed in the Senate, it would go over to the House, and the process would start all over again. Now, what does it matter in terms of which way, which chamber takes up the bill first? It usually doesn't matter except in the case of tax bills. Remember, according to Article 1 of the Constitution, all tax bills must start in the House of Representatives. The founders looked at that in terms of we need to make sure that um, the idea was that the founders had envisioned that the House of Representatives would be closer to the people, and if the people wanted to raise taxes, then they could answer to the people in the House of Representatives first. So being closest to the people and being the people's house, the idea there was that the House of Representatives would take up the tax bills first, because if there was going to be a whim of the masses against any tax legislation, it would be felt first in the House of Representatives. So let's assume then that this goes to the other chamber. It goes through the same process, either in the House or the Senate. And as a result, both of the chambers then pass some semblance of a bill that is similar, maybe with amendments made in each of the chambers, but they've made changes along the way. Then both both versions of this bill, if you will go to a conference committee, and that's where it's made up of members of the House and the Senate that are going to work out these differences. They're going to work out the amendments. They're going to work out the edits and the changes and where the language isn't the same. And the reason for that is because, according to the Constitution, both chambers must pass a word-for-word, exactly same, identical bill in both chambers in order for the bill to go on to the president for his potential signature for approval or veto. So as a result of that, the conference committee will then work out the differences. They'll send it back to both chambers for an up or down vote. In many cases, no amendments at that point in time because the amendments have all been worked out and ironed out by the conference committee. And then they will approve the bill, and then the bill gets sent off to the president. So, and that's the box we see here. So it goes to the president, and the president essentially has three options. The president can sign the bill into law. We have a nice signing ceremony out in the Rose Garden or in the Oval Office, and the president signs the bill into law. Yay, rah, rah, we're done, right? That's the first option. The second one is the president can veto that bill. Now we know that the House and Senate can override with a 2/3 vote. They can override that veto. Or the president can do what's called a pocket veto, and that's where the president doesn't veto it but doesn't sign it either. He leaves it on his desk, and after 10 days, if Congress is in session, again, 10 days not including Sundays, mind you, if it sits on the desk for 10 days and Congress is still in session, then the bill becomes law. If Congress is out of session at that point and it's still sitting on the president's desk, the bill dies. So that is one way that the president can kind of distance himself from a veto by kind of waiting it out to see if Congress is going out of session. Leave the bill on the desk. I don't really want to sign it, but I don't want to veto it either for the backlash. I'll kind of let it die its own miserable death. And that's the option that the president has in so doing. So there are two ways there that the president can kill a bill. But again, with a veto, if Congress is still in session, the president vetoes it, Congress can go back and override the veto. So if Congress has that time and that option, they can override the veto with 2/3. But again, that's 2/3 of both chambers, the House and the Senate. Essentially, think of it as a supermajority that it would need to pass that. So that's pretty significant in terms of trying to make that happen. And we can count the number of times that Congress has overridden a presidential veto. So keep that in mind. This is another version of essentially the same thing that I talked about here. I kind of like this version because it's a little cleaner, but you're more than welcome to pause the video and take a look at that version as well. But that's essentially how a bill becomes a law. So keep in mind that bills travel at different paces. Some bills go through quickly, like the tax bill that the Republican Party was setting the agenda for. It went through the Ways and Means Committee, where tax bills start, mind you, and went through committee, went through full House, went to the Senate, went to the committees, went over to the Senate, the full Senate for a vote, and then went back to a conference committee, ironed out the details, went to both the House and the Senate chambers, and that was a pretty fast track process. For some bills, that may take 2 years if it ever happens at all. So that's important to note. About 10,000 bills, maybe 8 to 10,000 bills can be introduced in a Congress in a 2-year biennial period. But keep in mind that only a few hundred at most are actually signed into law. Many of them will die in subcommittee, many of them will die in committee, many of them die on the House floor. More of them, I would advise, would die in committee or subcommittee. And remember, the Senate and House have their own committees and subcommittees, so you've got thousands of bills essentially dying in those committees that never see the light of day. So it's only a few hundred at most in that 2-year biennial period that the president would be taking a look at those types of bills. Many of them budget bills, funding the government, tax-related bills, obviously war or something significant in terms of timeliness. Other bills, they die an untimely death on the floor of the subcommittee or the committee. In terms of introducing a bill, by the way, the hopper in the House is a very common method, basically putting a hard copy bill in the hopper located on the House floor, and they recognize it in the Senate. A lot of this is done electronically today, so it's not necessarily needed, but a lot of that can be done electronically, and so much of that is initiated in that particular fashion. Now, keep in mind that it has to be a member of Congress that introduces a bill. The president cannot introduce a bill. The president can propose that Congress take up action on a bill, but it has to be a member of the House or Senate that is introducing that bill in their particular chamber, respectively. So a House member in the House and a senator in the Senate. And then obviously committees is where the real work gets done. On the floor of the House and Senate is really where the speeches, the votes, kind of the big picture stuff. But the real work is done in committee. And if you've ever seen one on television or on C-SPAN, it can be very grueling. Especially if they're going over line by line details of a 500-page bill, you don't want to be stuck in the room when that happens. But the idea there is that the committee is really where a lot of the work gets done. And that's why so many bills die in committee, because that's where most of the work on the bill to find out whether it's feasible or not to move forward with it actually takes place. Hearings are also held in those committees and subcommittees. That's where they call in experts. And as I mentioned in the part one of this video on Congress, they can go in and basically grill Q&A with experts and grill them on different questions they have related to their particular area of expertise. Secretaries of the various departments within the bureaucracy get called in by the House and the Senate subcommittees in terms of testifying before Congress. That is part of their role as the secretary of their respective agencies, of their respective departments. And so that's where a lot of that type of work gets done in Congress. They also do what's called a markup, a committee markup. And that's really where they go line by line through each line of a bill, all of the lines on every page, all 500 pages of a bill. And they basically mark it up in terms of editing and revising and then reporting that out to a committee if it's a subcommittee, or reporting it out to the full House or Senate if it's a committee itself. If the bill isn't reported out, the House can use a method called a discharge petition, and that is where you're basically circumventing the committee chair, getting a majority on the committee to vote to send it to the full floor of the House. This is not a popular way to handle bills because obviously leadership doesn't like it when you go beyond them to report out a bill, but it is possible for a committee to be able to do that, and voting on a discharge petition would allow them to send it directly to the full House for a vote. Closed rule means there are usually no amendments to very few, and the time limit is very strict on the amount of debate. Usually it's very limited in terms of, okay, we'll give an hour to the party that supports the bill, we'll give an hour to the party that opposes the bill, usually 1-minute speeches or by 40 members or whatever it is, because in between that would typically take up an hour for 1 minute speeches, and then 20 seconds in between or so forth. Open rule, you can have amendments on the floor. There's still a limited time, but it's a much larger. Maybe they've got all afternoon and evening to talk about this bill. Maybe they've got a couple of days to debate this bill on the floor, so people can give longer speeches. It was much more open, but again, not as open as you would see in the Senate side, where senators can get up and speak and talk more freely. There still are rules that even in open rule, a lot more amendments to be accepted here, but there still is time limitations because again, you've got 435 members. And then restrictive rule is permitting some things and really kind of clamping down on the time and the amendments and that sort of thing. And that's probably one of the most popular that we see, is the Rules Committee basically pulling rank on the bill and how much time is given to it, and what types of amendments can be submitted for it. So the committee of the whole is the idea that you're going to debate it as the entire body. Obviously, that's very procedural in nature. It doesn't happen as often because the idea here is that you are considering something of mass importance, but it's not the run of the mill. Most of those bills are going to committees and subcommittees where they're organized and where they would that type of thing would take place. Again, in the Senate, you really don't have those kinds of limitations because of the ability of a much smaller group of people that are debating these issues, and they have longer time limits, obviously, to debate them. So in terms of the types of voting that we see in the House that they can take, we do have roll call votes, which is essentially you're using an electronic device, usually a card like a credit card. They would swipe and then tabulate in their vote, yay, nay, abstaining, or voting present. Um, a voice vote where it's basically by acclamation. All those in favor say aye, opposed say nay, and they're done. There's a division vote where the idea is if division is called, people stand and basically count the ayes, count the nays. And then there's a teller vote where people will go and basically walk through. This is very common in the House of Commons in the British Parliament, where people will pass through a hallway and they pass on one side if they're yay, and pass on the other side, or aye, and pass on the other side if they're nay. We see that in the House of Commons because there are, again, so many of them. But more often than not, we see the roll call vote in today's House and Senate in terms of the in terms of that type of vote. So the roll call vote is more common. I will tell you the Senate doesn't have an electronic device. It's a very complicated system that the Senate uses, and I'm being facetious. It's basically thumbs up, thumbs down. So if you ever watch them on C-SPAN, you'll see a senator point to the clerk and basically give a thumbs up. That means they voted for the bill, and thumbs down, no. So it's a very complicated system, as you can imagine, very intricate in nature, but at any rate, that is, with only 100 members, they don't need as complicated a system. With 435 members, you obviously need some type of a system with all of the bills you're voting on in order to tabulate those votes and do it quickly. So that's the significant difference there in terms of the House and Senate measures. Another thing to point out here is that if the changes are pretty minor, usually the other house accepts the changes without a whole lot of whole lot of concern. Many times they don't even need a conference committee because they can work it out among leadership and then just take it back for an up or down vote. But if it is much more substantive, a conference committee would be appointed. The tax bill is a good example of that. And then obviously, once it's voted on by both chambers, it goes on to the president, where the president would decide to sign it into law. Here's President George W. Bush in a signing ceremony in the Rose Garden, essentially signing a bill, and there's House leadership behind him. You've got Speaker Boehner there and a number of senators as well at the signing ceremony. Again, if the president decides to veto it, it would go back to the original House where the original chamber where it started, and the idea is that they would need 2/3 of both chambers, both bodies, in order to override that vote. If they both do override the vote, then the president's veto is overridden and the bill becomes a law. There are lots of political cartoons, as you can imagine, related to the legislative process because it is so complicated. You can pause and take a look at that one, but we'll see many of those in class as well. The Congress also does pass a simple type of legislation called resolutions. A simple resolution is usually more ceremonial in nature, doesn't really have a whole lot of effect. Usually, if you've ever heard of a bill that names today, National Donut Day or National, Francis Scott Key Day. This would be by simple resolution that we would see that. Many times it's to please the voters back home who are watching on the news and seeing their member of Congress passing this type of resolution. If it is significant in terms of maybe it's a member of the Senate or House or a former president that died and they're designating a day for the president or a national day of mourning or something like that if the president passed away, or a former member of the Senate or House, a legend had passed away. They may pass a concurrent resolution. And again, if it's a joint resolution, the idea here is a resolution, mind you, not an amendment. But if it is a joint resolution, the president may even get involved in signing that, but doesn't necessarily need to. Again, they're very ceremonial in nature, don't necessarily have the full force of law per se, because they're very ceremonial. An amendment by both chambers, a resolution that is an amendment to the Constitution, would not be signed by the president, but would be passed by both chambers and would need to be passed by both chambers before it was passed on to the states for ratification of that particular amendment. So, Congress, how do they vote? Well, they vote in either two models. They either vote the delegate model, which is the idea that your constituents basically want you to vote the way they vote. You're voting as a delegate of their wishes, okay? And the trustee model is we trust you. Trustee, trust me, is what I always tell students. Trustee, trust me. The idea there is you're not just going to do what they want, but you're going to you're going to make a decision based on what information you have, based on what you find helpful. And so that may mean that you may not necessarily vote the way they think you will. Because it is a trustee model, you have access to information they don't. You may vote to go to war or against the war and against the view of your constituents because you know more than they do in terms of the information you have access to. So it is often possible that members of Congress will go back and forth in terms of voting the wishes of their delegates in the delegate, or the wishes of their constituents in this delegate model, as well as in the trustee model. So we see both of these at play in terms of how they vote on the floor itself. Again, I said 8 to 10,000 bills are what typically cross the desk of Congress, and usually those are in subcommittees and committees where they die an untimely death. But keep in mind, a lot of times they're introducing bills just for the sake of introducing bills. Again, getting press back home, getting in the media and on the 6 o'clock news to say that they're actually doing something out here in Washington, that Washington Beltway who doesn't do anything. Many of them are looking to raise awareness about a particular issue that's in the bill that they want to address. And so maybe they know that there is no chance of getting this seatbelt bill passed, but they're raising awareness on seatbelt safety, and they want to make it more of an issue so that maybe it'll pass with extensive modifications down the road. So that's really where they are looking for introducing the bill in order to get that type of awareness. Now, obviously, a member of Congress or a senator cannot be an expert on 8,000 different bills. And this is where they rely on interest groups. They rely on colleagues. They rely on their staff to really help them. And this is where I mentioned, even working as a Senate staffer, the idea here was they could take a bill or a particular topic and get two different interest groups to come in and give them talking points on both sides of the issue, and evidence and research and more data to back up their points of view to take to the senator or to the member of Congress, and then they could make an informed decision based on that information. And that's really where interest groups can help an elected official, not a candidate, because the most thing they value is money, but to an elected official, they value information from those interest groups, and they can be really vital to the success or failure of a bill based on what type of information and evidence and data that they can give to a member of Congress to help them in making a decision on a bill. Constituents will help with that as well. They write letters, they send emails, they make phone calls. The significance there is many times it's in numbers. They're looking at viewpoints, just like with interest groups. They're looking at data, they're looking at research. Their own ideological bent is also important. If you are a very conservative Republican or a very liberal Democrat, your ideology is going to factor into your viewpoint on a bill. But again, as I said, the interest groups are really vital here because you can use them essentially against each other in order to get more information on on a particular bill or topic. Now, obviously, the political parties have a role here. They're not the experts on much information in bills, but they can help in terms of what other information they can share here. And then obviously the president and the president's staff can help if there's a bill they're trying to push through, like this tax bill that President Trump and the Trump administration were trying to put through. That's an important point, that they can get members in line and get the majority whip or the minority whip to kind of get the party in line to vote the way that they want. Um, we could talk all day about ethics issues related to members of Congress and what they've done wrong. You can imagine when people are in positions of power, we've seen just over the last couple of years in terms of the types of things that we should be telling people not to do, and yet we see members of Congress doing all sorts of things. They have really clamped down in terms of the types of gifts that can be offered, but as we know when we talked about lobbyists, there are ways around it. So you can't take a lobbyist can't take a member of Congress or their staff to lunch, but if you stand up and you have a sandwich somewhere, it's okay. That type of thing there's always loopholes, there's always ways around them, but the best method is really to stick with them with information and keep it professional, and keep it to the information that you need and how they can help you. They're going to develop a great iron triangle relationship with members of Congress and their staffs if they're there providing information, providing data, providing research. That's going to be the most valuable tool that an interest group can provide, and that's really what members of Congress are looking for from those interest groups. They don't care about meals, they don't care about gifts or trips, or those are all nice things, but that doesn't help them do their job. That doesn't help make their job easier. It's really that information, that data, that research that's really going to help. So why is it people think that Congress is so bad? Because, as we talked about in class, when I call up my member of Congress and I say, hey, I didn't get my Social Security check today, they have a staff member that's ready to call up the Social Security Administration, get somebody on the phone, and get my check FedExed out to me so I have it tomorrow. They get it into my bank account. They make things happen. My son needs a recommendation for the Naval Academy. Somebody on staff gets the Congress member's recommendation written and gets it signed off on and sent to the Naval Academy. This is a beautiful thing. I love it when members of Congress can help me. And my member of Congress is great, right? But all those other members of Congress, they don't do anything up there. And what do we hear in the news? That they're a do-nothing Congress. How many Congresses have been labeled do-nothing Congresses? Many, many, many of them. And this is why their approval rating is very low. It is also very easy to look at a group of people that you don't know and don't know much about and say that, hey, throw the bums out because they're not doing anything. And that's why their approval rating is so low. And in many cases, I think today's is about 13%, so which is down from what we see here from 2016. But the idea there is that they love their member of Congress because they get things done. They do things for them. But the rest of Congress, not so much. Okay, and that perception is a huge factor that plays into people's perception in the approval ratings, or more importantly, the disapproval ratings of members of Congress. I can call my member, they get things done. I call them up about a particular issue and in the local government, and they contact or put me in touch with somebody here locally. They make things happen. And that's why people love their member of Congress, which is why many of them are in such safe seats. Gerrymandering aside, of course, but that is an important point, that people love that access. They love being able to call and get an answer and get results. But the rest of Congress, oh, throw the bums out, right? So the polls, when we look at polls, people want taxes on the wealthy, but people don't necessarily want more gun control laws. People want immigration reform, but they don't necessarily want to pay for those things. There's lots of pressures back and forth. But why is the House not as responsive to these types of needs? Because in many cases they're in gerrymandered safe seats, and they don't need to be. They don't need to be in those taking strong positions out on the in the moderate point of view, especially if they're in a district where they're pretty much safe, and they're not going to rock the boat if they don't have to. All right, this leads us to some practice questions. So take a look here. Hope this has helped in part 2, and live the 5.